I'm Duncan MacLeod. Welcome to the TechCentral Show. We're glad you're here. If you haven't subscribed yet, youtube.com/TechCentral or any of the best podcasting platforms out there, you'll find the show. Just search TechCentral on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, you name it, you'll find us. Now, we don't often speak about open source software and Linux on this show very often, and we probably should, given how important it's actually become behind the scenes in running the world. It hasn't succeeded on the desktop, which I think probably frustrates a lot of Linux fans who have wanted that to happen for decades now. But Linux, in one form or another, is pretty much everywhere. It runs the cloud, it's on our phones, etc., and it's become incredibly important. It's become like an underpinning, I guess, to the world of IT. And I thought to chat with the CEO of Obsidian Systems, Muggie van Staden, who I have not seen in probably 20 years, would be a great one to do. Muggie, thanks for making the time. Thanks for coming into the studio.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Glad to be here.
I was shocked to discover 5 minutes ago, before we started recording, that you don't actually run Linux on your desktop, that you're in fact a Mac user. Why?
I'm not as technical as a lot of the people that work for Obsidian are.
Right.
And it was just something that I personally struggled with. I tried it for probably 3 to 6 months back in the 90s.
Which distro did you use back then?
So
long ago.
The techies tried me to use several of them. Then it was, try this one, it's easier. This one's more user-friendly. Right. But, the second time I couldn't get documents to print, I gave up.
Okay.
So personally, I've always been a Windows user. And only recently made the switch to Mac, so still
Mac,
wrapping my head around those two.
Okay. Which do you prefer, Mac or Windows?
I've only been on Mac for a week, so ask me next week.
Okay, you're
frustrations both sides.
A newbie to the world of Mac. Okay. But I was really surprised to discover that, in fact, you've been using Windows all these years, even though you work for an open source software company. How did you get into the world of open source?
Our company started in 1995.
Yeah.
We were a bunch of engineering students at the old Rand Afrikaans University.
Okay.
And one of the founding members kind of said, he's tired of buying hardware from other people. He thinks we should start a company and sell hardware to students.
Okay.
That was the original idea. And one of the guys stumbled on Linux. And being at a university...
When was this?
1995.
Okay. Linux had just come out then. It was.
Yes, it was. I think it came in 93, whatever.
92, 93. It was starting. I remember I was actually working in my first job at the time, and one of the pioneering users, Clayton Nash was his name. You may even know him. He worked on various publications as a journalist back in those days. I think he lives in the UK now. But he was one of the very early users of Linux. I think he read the original manifesto, if there was one, by Linus Torvalds, and he was that was my first exposure to, and it was purely a command line Unix-based operating system back then. None of the fancy bells and whistles you get.
So one of the founding members, Anton de Wet, he kind of discovered it on the internet. And we were fortunate enough in those days, being at a university, we were one of the few people that actually had access to the internet. So we downloaded it and he started playing with it. And then one of the professors had a problem with a Unix system. And he said, could you come and have a look? And Anton went and he fiddled and he got it working. And as he walked out, the professor said, well, please send me your invoice. And we were like, wait, we can charge money for this? And early on, we decided this is something that we think is unique. And we love the concept of collaborative software development. A lot of people still think open source is a religion. Some behave that way, but it's not. It's just a fantastic way of developing software. And I guess our first break was Nando's.
Nando's.
We deployed a Linux system in every Nando's store in South Africa in the late 90s.
Wow.
So we ate a lot of chicken.
Point of sale terminals.
Their backend, no, it was not. Okay. So it was just their backend was at that stage a Unix system, and we replaced it with a Linux system. Right. And Anton coded a thing that would distribute, update stuff that you now take for granted with things like Red Hat Satellite and SUSE Manager and those kind of things. But we coded it from scratch, and we ran that whole network, and that was our big break.
Right.
And other than that, we built email system for schools.
For schools? Okay.
Because once again, in the 90s, it wasn't that Microsoft gave away the technology to schools like they'd done recently. So a lot of the schools couldn't afford email systems. So we would put down a Linux system and provide email for every scholar. That's how we started making our money. And then as you look in the history, when Red Hat became the bad guys and started charging for Linux, our world changed heavily. And we had to jump on that bandwagon and be part of explaining to people why you have the Fedoras and the Red Hat Enterprise Linux is why you need to pay for it. So we've come a long way in educating people on why open source like you said earlier, we're now pretty much, it is everywhere.
A lot of people associate open source with free, as in free beer. But it's not really. I mean, it refers to free speech or freedom rather than the price of it. So you can buy open source software that actually pays money. It costs money.
And
Linux just happens mostly to be free.
Yes. So there's an article, if you go Google it on YouTube, it's around the beekeeper. It's written by James Dixon. He was the CIO of Pento. This was probably 10 years ago. And for me, it's one of the best analogies I've ever heard explaining to people why you need companies like a Red Hat, like a SUSE that charges for this. And it's the concept of bees make honey. It's the only things that do it, and they like the software developers in the open source world. All they want to do is code. They're terrible at writing documentation. They're not great at roadmaps. They just like to code, and it's like a bee making honey. Now you have a housewife that wants to consume the honey. She wants to walk into a retail store and buy it in a pretty bottle. Now there's no way the bees will ever do that. You can pay them as much money, it's just not in their nature. And the same thing here. So what you have in between in the bee world is a beekeeper. They go, there's a demand for this type in this bottle, etc. And they charge money for that. But with the money, they then create environments for the bees to flourish. So that relationship is the same as the open source world. That you have Red Hat. They take money from people, but they provide an environment for the open source coders to do all of the magic that we do. So for me, it's one of the best analogies on how this enterprise open source thing works and why you pay money for certain things.
Right. Before we talk about cloud and enterprise stuff, let's stay on the desktop just a bit longer. I know you were joking earlier that next year will be the year of the Linux desktop, and next year, of course, it'll be the next year. Why do you think Linux hasn't taken off on the desktop? I mean, I've installed some distros. I play around occasionally. I've got an old laptop I installed it on for fun. And it's actually it looks pretty good. It's quite usable. I think there's still some tricky stuff like installing drivers, for example, occasionally might run you into a bit of difficulty. And that might be easier on Windows or Mac. But generally speaking, it looks pretty end-user friendly. Why is it not used more broadly, do you think?
I think it's those small nuances. If the printer can't work, if you're a typical home user,
it's too technical.
You then get stuck. And for guys that run this on their servers and look after customer servers, for them to then quickly go in and VI and make a change to something and get it working, for them it's fine. But your average computer user, I think it's just too technical.
You've gone to Mac personally, and I know quite a few developers who develop in Linux who run Mac and run macOS. Why is Apple so popular amongst Linux developers?
I think I guess the core code is similar. That's why they kind of like it.
So the command line is familiar commands.
And like you said earlier, it just works.
Stable, it's robust.
And maybe there's an element of, the open source guys have always had something against Microsoft. I don't know if there's still that element in there.
We're going to talk about that in a moment. But I imagine most of the people at Obsidian are running Linux on the desktop.
Most of the technical staff, but we have quite a few that are moving towards Mac.
Right.
But none of the technical guys are running Windows, to give you an idea. So it's either Linux or Mac.
Apart from yourself, who's running Windows until last week, is there anyone running Windows in your organization?
Most of the sales and admin stuff. For the very reason that when they're at home and they can't print or scan, then it creates additional challenges.
Wow, interesting stuff. Let's talk about Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft was this hated. I mean, they were Satan in the open source world for many years. Steve Ballmer famously described the GPL, which is the license that governs much of open source software, as a cancer that is infecting IT, which obviously did not go down well amongst the Linux community and open source developers. But what is the view of Microsoft in the open source community today? Today you've got the Windows subsystem for Linux. Microsoft bought GitHub, which I know is very controversial amongst some in the developer community. Is Microsoft still the great Satan, or is it seen as more of a partner to open source now?
I think definitely more of a partner.
Okay.
The fact that they themselves have open sourced a lot of their code, you mentioned GitHub, that they acquired. I think Microsoft as a whole has had a fundamental change from the Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer days to where we are now with Satya Nadella and them. They have a much more, dare I say, open view of the world, and understanding that, and we mentioned it earlier, open source is literally everywhere. And that's why 20 years ago it was an enormous differentiator. This technology is open source, this one is not. We don't have those discussions with customers anymore.
Okay.
Honestly, 20 years ago, it was pretty much every meeting was, this is why you want to use open source. It's not dangerous because people can see the code. It actually is better. Yeah. Nobody almost cares about that anymore. Yeah. I think it's because it's everywhere.
And what happened with Microsoft, which is interesting, is they pivoted as an organization. It's one thing Microsoft has done so well compared to other tech companies. IBM was not successful in pivoting, for example. And they're a fraction of the size they used to. They don't dominate the industry like they used to. But Microsoft seems to have this inbuilt ability to pivot. We saw it in the late 90s with the internet browser wars, and we've seen it again recently as they pivoted to Azure and cloud services, which is now the bulk of their business. Do you think it's the fact that Windows has become less important to Microsoft that's actually driven this maybe a cultural change within the organization where they say, well, actually Linux is not a real threat to us anymore because we're not the Windows company anymore?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. Yeah. I hear it often that operating systems are a commodity. It doesn't really matter what you run. And I think that has changed for somebody like Microsoft. It was a core for them that it's now they have to look at other revenue streams, and cloud is such a dominant thing for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. So I think, yes, they are a wonderful organization to follow the history and how they had the ability to reinvent themselves. And I think probably the thing that they reinvented the most and the deepest was their culture. And that's very difficult to do for any organization. And I think that's something that you can applaud them. You might not always like all of their tech and some of the things they did in the past, but you've got to applaud the fact that they reinvented themselves from a culture point of view in now open and working well. And even if you look at the relationship between Red Hat and Microsoft and how that has evolved over the last 20, 30 years, they're now good friends. A lot of Red Hat runs on top of Azure. I mean, you can even run Microsoft SQL on Red Hat. So how the world has changed from what we had 15, 20 years ago.
So you think Microsoft can be trusted these days? Certainly a lot of Linux enthusiasts 10 or 20 years ago would have said you cannot trust this organization. Do you think they're a trusted partner now?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, no, I think there's. I think a lot of that animosity has disappeared over the years.
Yeah.
There's none of that anymore. I think once again, cloud has driven people to go, well, these guys have great tools. And even if I speak to some of our developers, some of the tooling that you get from Microsoft is really amazing. They love it. They've gotten over the fact that it comes from Bill and his friends.
And you can go into Azure and sign up and get a Linux instance in the cloud, and it's all from Microsoft. Fascinating stuff. Of course, Linux has succeeded elsewhere. Well, I don't know if you can technically call it Linux, but there are billions of devices in the world effectively running Linux. You probably have one in your pocket. I have one in my pocket, and that's Android.
Yes.
I mean, is Android Linux? It's got its basis in open source.
My understanding is yes. I know at some stage they forked, and then, if my memory serves me, they merged the kernel again. Whether it's the same now, I'm not sure. But fundamentally, in my view, it's Linux, and it's everywhere.
And it's certainly still it's open source software, and it's absolutely everywhere. And on that basis, I mean, is it the most successful operating system in history?
I would think so. Yeah. And I think for me, it's always, we use the example, it's the one operating system that you can pretty much deploy on any architecture. So if you look at the Unixes, if you look at Microsoft, no other operating system can make the claim that they can run from the mainframe to a watch.
Yeah.
It's the one thing that open source and Linux did do.
Right.
And that was the power of it. If you wanted to deploy it on a watch, you could go and make the changes and put it on a watch. With the proprietary ones, you didn't have that ability, and that's what made it so successful.
On the proviso, of course, that your changes are shared back with the community. Yeah,
because that's just a good and nice thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, does that turn some people away from open source? The fact that you have to, the license requires you to share your code.
I think some people don't like it, and I think some people maybe get around it and don't always stick to the rules. I mean, there are well-documented cases where they've been taken to court by different entities because of that. But yeah, if you look at the amount of licensing options in the open source world, it's also frightening. There's so many of them. Yeah. But I think that it's just about the principle. We're building something together. Like I said right in the beginning, open source it's a development model. It's not a religion. And it's probably not even a good business model, but it's that collaborative development. And if you buy into that, then why wouldn't you want to make the things that you make better, share it with others? Because you're quick enough to take it, give it back. And that's just, I think, the fundamental, irrespective of the license. Look at the principle of what the culture is.
Is that compatible with the free market? Is it compatible with capitalism?
Well, you see, that's where the beekeeper comes in. You have companies like SUSE, Ubuntu, Red Hat, they compete. But collectively, they fund that base that they all work on. And from there, they charge for their differentiator. But they're willing to work together on that base. And that, for me, is... think about it, it's beautiful in my mind. It's a beautiful concept. If more people did the same thing in everything that we do in society, wouldn't we be all better off?
Philosophical questions. Let's talk a little bit about the enterprise and cloud. I guess a good place to start would be to ask you what conversations you're having with your clients about enterprise IT right now.
Yeah, I think we realize that most of our customers, in my mind, have a similar problem. They have data centers, they have some branch technology, they have some IoT technology and edge technology, and even a desktop be considered edge technology. So it doesn't matter if you're a small mom and pop shop or if you're the biggest bank in South Africa, you fundamentally have that challenge. Then you are inundated with infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service providers coming to you and say, just give it to us. We can do this bit better, this bit better. And as a small business owner or a CIO of a bank, your challenge is, what do I run where and why? And, I have lots of small customers that will go, but we don't have the same worries. And I go, but you do. Your email, it's probably cloud-based. So you make use of a software as a service or a platform as a service, whether you realize it or not. Your desktop of your accounting lady at home, it's an edge device in your network. It's the same fundamental problem. And we're helping our customers just traverse this wonderful world of hybrid IT. What do you put where, why? And then the important thing is, how do you manage and control that? How do you make sure, whether it's a piece of data, whether it's a container, whether it's a VM, that if I deploy it, I know it's my standards from a security and a governance point of view, but I have the ability to move them around between all of these wonderful platforms. And that's a world, how our business has changed, and those are the things that we're trying to help customers with.
So has Obsidian become less of a, how can I describe this, less of a technical-focused company and more of a business consulting focus?
A bit of both. We still do we fundamentally...
still do the hardcore techie stuff.
Absolutely, but we start with that question and that idea of, okay, great, we're going to deploy, let's take a data solution, is having the discussion with the CIOs to go and say, well, right, we're going to deploy the data, but we have to worry about things like governance. Who has access to what piece of code? The data lineage. Do you even know where it landed in your network, how it was moved, who made what changes? Those are the principal questions that we need to unpack, and then we can go and say, great stuff. To address some of those, here are some of the deep technical tooling that we can help you address it. Because at the end of the day, you've got to understand why somebody's wanting something, whether it's a VM, a container, a piece of data.
Yeah. And if the best solution is not open source?
we will gladly go with what the customer, what the best solution is. Our days of being fanatical about open source, I guess, is also come and gone.
Okay.
We have
So you'll work alongside Microsoft in an organization?
With the greatest of pleasure. Yeah. They're everywhere. And that many years ago, I even said to people, it shouldn't be about open source. It should be about open standards and the ability to deploy something cross-platform.
Yeah.
It shouldn't actually matter whether it's open source. Open source typically gives you those things. But if you go and let's pick on a few vendors, if you have an Oracle database and I can deploy it on multiple OSs, that solves the problem of, is it cross-platform? I always said, if a piece of technology forces a customer and tells him or dictates what happens around it, I go, it's a bad piece of technology, irrespective if it's proprietary or open source. The moment you start dictating, but it can only run on this OS, it can only run on this hardware, then I start questioning, and I openly say to my customers, you should think about this, because it's a tunnel decision and they tend to be difficult to get out of.
Right.
If you pick open standards and cross-platform, you should, in theory, have the ability for choice later on that's not dictated by somebody else.
Right. And how many organizations, end-user organizations, actually ask that question?
Too few. But that's part of what we do.
Vendor lock. I mean, vendors are known for doing lock-in. That's what they do. How many organizations that you speak to are in that position of being locked in by their vendor?
I think too many, and some of the cloud providers has become the new vendor lock-in.
Right.
Honestly, let's be frank about that.
Sure.
In
fact, a lot of people are now saying you should not have a single cloud vendor as your service provider, and that you should have a multi-cloud strategy. What's your views around that, and what companies should be doing?
Our view is that you have to lock into certain technologies. I don't think you have a choice. But you can pick what you lock into, and we believe you should lock into abstraction layers.
Okay. Meaning?
Something like, let's take some container platforms, whether it's Rancher, whether it's OpenShift. The point is, I can deploy containers anywhere on my own data center or in any infrastructure as a service provider. So it gives me the ability to still have choice on where I deploy it, but I've locked into a Rancher or an OpenShift. Alternative is I go and say, I run EKS, AKS, each one of these different ones, but then you have the complexity of you don't have standardization. So lock into things that give you an abstraction layer.
Right.
That's just what our advice would be, because it gives you the ability to go, well, cool, if I'm not happy with Azure, I can move to AWS.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of technologies out there that facilitate this.
Yeah.
But that's the question. Vendors are great at telling customers how to go into their platforms. And we help our customers to just say, well, you should ask them, how do we get out?
Yeah.
It's not something vendors always will go and volunteer, but it's a key question that customers
What if this relationship goes wrong?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is what if I want to get out? How do I get out? Can I export? Can I put that into a different cloud provider? They're quick to give you import tools, not that quick on saying, how do you get off?
Of course. Cool. So you must be doing a lot of, historically you must have done a lot of on-premises work, Linux servers running in corporate data centers with everyone moving almost everyone moving to cloud solutions. You must be interfacing a lot more with AWS and Azure and platforms like that. So are you finding as Obsidian that you're doing most of your development work in cloud environments now?
Combinations. You still have certain environments that will always be in the data center. And what we're also seeing, a lot of our customers, they might have gone cloud 2 years ago, and now they're actually starting to move certain workloads back.
Why is that?
Cost.
Cost. Okay.
Yeah, for a lot of them.
It is so easy to spin up processes in the cloud, and suddenly you see your invoice come through from Microsoft or Amazon, and it's shocking.
and that's why we always go, once again, pick an abstraction layer that you have that ability, that I can move a workload from on-prem to Azure, AWS, GCP.
Yeah.
Now, if I ran into a cost issue there, or a regulator for whatever reason decides cloud vendor A is a bad idea for South Africa, if I don't have a way to move that workload, I'm now locked into a really bad situation. And that's what we try, and it might cost you a little bit more in the beginning. But I believe in the long run, that choice will save you a lot of money. And as for us in cloud, we are an AWS partner. Okay. You know, we in discussions with the guys from Google. We've tried many times to work together with Microsoft. So our customers work with all three, and so do we. We don't have a choice. So, but it's once again that Linux, the power of it, Linux can run anywhere. So it's for us, it's a form of an abstraction layer. So, Mr. Customer, if you want to run it bare metal, VM, a container, anywhere, we can still help you facilitate that. And just like we did for Nando's, how do you manage that distributed network and make sure that everything is up to date, everything is governed to your rules? So fundamentally, it's still, in my mind, similar to what we've been doing.
So, I mean, do you see some industries that have more of a proclivity to open source than others, or is it sort of a mixed bag?
A mixed bag, and like I said, it's no longer such a big discussion. It's wonderful and sad in the same sentence because we just don't talk about it anymore. 10 years ago, it was every meeting that we did was the debate about explaining what is open source,
proprietary versus open source. So that discussion is not happening anymore. When those discussions were happening 10 years ago, was it largely around price? Or was it around other issues?
Anything from principles. We had several customers that would go, but surely this is dangerous. If people can see the code. People can see the code, and it's like, no, it's actually more secure. So there was a lot of education in the early days just on the principles of the code is open. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. You should actually see, and people would go, but how can it be secure? It's secure because everybody can check it. That's why. So there was a lot of that, but that doesn't happen anymore. I haven't had that discussion in a very long time.
Fascinating. So where do you see this all this going? I mean, you Obsidian's history has been in open source. You started as the Linux company, as an open source company. What is just looking at how the industry's changed over the last 10, 15, 20 years, where does it go next, and what does Obsidian become? I know it's unfair to ask you 10 or 20 years from now. Let's say 5 years from now. What is Obsidian?
We strive to be the best solution provider for open solutions. It doesn't have to be open source, and that's why I said earlier it's about that open standards, cross-platform, the ability of having choice. It's still fundamental for us. It always has been through everything that we try to do.
It's like a philosophical underpinning to your business.
Because I really believe it's the right thing for a customer. And I've had big fights with some of our vendors when they insist on things that doesn't give a customer choice. So still providing open solutions and giving customers the ability to move a workload, to understand that lock-in can be very dangerous, make them aware of it. But I've openly said to our customers, if they still after that go, but I want to go down that tunnel, I'll help them go down the tunnel. But I will remind them often, we warned you that this is a tunnel. Don't do tunnel stuff. Rather go for cross-platform, the ability to move stuff. So fundamentally, an open solution helping our customers traverse this beautiful hybrid IT world.
Right. And Microsoft's cool in this new world too.
Absolutely.
Muggie van Staden is CEO of Obsidian Systems. Thanks so much for joining us in the studio.
Duncan, thank you for your time.
Thank you.